Hello, everyone. I think you can see me. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all to this week 7 seminar of the Caribbean Studies Network webinar series. And it's a real pleasure to welcome Dunja Fehimović to the Caribbean Studies Network. We've been waiting to have Dunja for a really long time, and as one of the key voices in Caribbean studies in the UK. So thank you for being here. So as many of you will know, Dunja is lecturer in Hispanic Studies at Newcastle University. She is a specialist on Caribbean visual culture, particularly film and also Caribbean music. In her research, she has explored really wonderful topics and questions of, for example, relationality, genre, place and space, ethics, as well as national, transnational, and diasporic identities. Among other publications, she is the author of a monograph, National Identity in 21st Century Cuban Cinema, Screening the Repeating Island, and that was published by Palgrave in 2018. And she's also co-edited with Rebecca Ogden, the collection entitled Branding Latin America, Strategies, Aims, and Resistance, which was published by Lexington Books in 2018. And today we're going to hear Dunja speak about this wonderful film that we were all treated to watching, Candela, which emerged last year. And I would like to thank here publicly, before Dunja begins, the production team who made it possible for us to watch the film, in particular Pablo Lozano, the producer. So without further ado, because we want to hear about this film that has been such a joy to watch, let's listen to Dunja and welcome Dunja to the Caribbean Studies Network.
Thank you so much, Maripili. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this works. Yes. Okay. So thanks again for having me. You know, I'm really excited to be part of the network's activities. I think it's such a great initiative, and I hope that, you know, we're going to work together more in the future. So as Maripili mentioned, I've been working on Cuban cinema for a while, but more recently I've been expanding my focus to think a bit more comparatively about film in the Caribbean, particularly Puerto Rican and Dominican cinema, as well as Cuban cinema. In January of 2020, I co-organized a conference called Mapping New Caribbean Cinema as part of the Festival de Nuevo Cine Global Dominicano in Santo Domingo. That was just before the pandemic hit. It was another lifetime where we traveled to Santo Domingo and met a lot of amazing people. Amongst the people that I met was Farías Cintrón, the director of the film that I'm going to be talking about today. I also learned more about Caribe Pop, which is a manifesto signed by a group of artists, filmmakers, and writers that tries to articulate a shared experience and an aesthetic of Caribbeanness. If you're interested in this manifesto, you can find it on the website, which is www.caribepop.com. The Caribe Pop Collective has given rise to and been built on different cultural expressions, not least of which is Rey Andújar's award-winning novel Candela, which was first published in 2007. It was turned into a short film called Tisnao by Farías Cintrón for his final project at the International Film School in San Antonio de los Baños in Cuba. He described Tisnao as a kind of sketch or pilot for what became the 2021 film Candela. And here I'll just briefly read out a synopsis of the film in case anybody hasn't managed to watch it yet. And this is taken from the Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival website. A hurricane threatens the Caribbean. As if driven by its coils, the lives of 3 strangers become intertwined in the streets of Santo Domingo. Sera Peña Blanca, a girl from Dominican high society who goes to the slums every night to interact with strangers. Lieutenant Perez, a corrupt policeman who investigates a case in an attempt to repair the broken relationship with his daughter. And Candela, a performer from a poor cabaret seeking justice. The 3 are united by the mysterious death of Renato Castrate, a poet and drug dealer. If you are interested in this Caribe Pop Manifesto and the signatories, you can find the recording of this online roundtable hosted earlier this year on the Facebook page, Caribbean Film Forum, which Mary Leonard and I created as a virtual successor to the conference mapping New Caribbean Cinema. The film I'm going to discuss today is a very free adaptation of Andújar's novel and proudly declares itself part of the Caribe Pop movement, if you like, with this official looking certification at its start. I quoted a line from the manifesto earlier, Caribe es ser y estar, es la catástrofe y la calamidad, el insostenible azar, soportar la realidad y gozarla. This is translated into English as, the Caribbean is the magnification of the verb to be. It is catastrophic. It is the calamity of unsustainable chances. It is putting up with reality and enjoying it to its last molecule. As always, I think something is lost in translation, but what stood out for me when I first read the manifesto was the complex sense of temporality that it evoked, not least through that distinction between ser and estar, which is, so memorable to those of us who have studied Spanish as a second language. It seemed to me that the manifesto articulated a characteristically Caribbean temporality, and watching the film only confirmed and enriched this impression. My first reading of the film then related to the connections between past, present, and future in the Caribbean, and especially how they are experienced in lived reality. Reading and thinking with the film further, I became interested in how it articulates a kind of entanglement that we might understand in terms of the Anthropocene and its weirding effects on time and agency. Finally, I want to propose briefly today that film might be seen as a privileged medium of entanglement, or what we might call, following David Chandler and Jonathan Pugh's recent book, Anthropocene Islands, storyation. But before I get further into the analysis, I want to emphasize this is very much a work in progress. So if anybody has any suggestions, reading recommendations, etc., viewing recommendations, they are gratefully received. And I also want to echo Maripili in thanking Andrés Farías Cintrón and the whole Candela team for their generosity, not only in sharing the film with us today, but also in kind of sending me lots of great material, the script, notes, all these brilliant things that have helped me with my analysis. So in his article, Tropical Apocalypse, Martin Munro follows a well-established tendency in scholarship on the Caribbean by proposing that the region foreshadows or anticipates the apocalyptic experience of our globalized present. The Caribbean was not only born out of an initial or originary apocalypse, but has also been shaped by repeated and ongoing apocalyptic cycles that have come to create a unique experience of time. Munro supports his claim with reference to the four horsemen of the Caribbean apocalypse: the inextricability of economic and ecological crises in the region, the lingering presence of historical traumas such as slavery, persistent inequalities, and criminality, corruption, and impunity. Each of these four horsemen is related to the other via a cause and effect, as well as in a more complex circular way. The result of this, according to Munro, is that the Caribbean seems closer to the apocalypse than ever, but in reality, it has inhabited these end times for centuries. This close relationship with the apocalyptic is borne out by key thinkers of time and history in the Caribbean. For example, Munro outlines how Aimé Césaire and Derek Walcott understand the region as a site of an apocalypse that nevertheless gives rise to a kind of redemption, or at least a new start or blank slate. By contrast, Antonio Benítez Rojo's anti-apocalyptic vision of the Caribbean was famously outlined in relation to his experience of watching two elderly Afro-Cuban women walk in a certain kind of way during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Munro sees in Benítez Rojo a post-negritude shift away from the essential and apocalyptic and towards the experiential and everyday. Indeed, in fields ranging from anthropology to disaster studies, a lot of recent scholarship has emphasized the need to pay attention to the experience of time as it's lived by those who survive seemingly apocalyptic events. these scholars reject the apocalyptic because of the way it seems to deny all agency to those on the ground, as it were. For example, Kasiamika and Ian Kellman coined the term sheeling, or slow healing, to emphasize the effortful and continuous process of recovery and reconstruction undertaken by individuals and communities in the wake of disaster. In this presentation, I want to argue that Candela offers a representation of a Caribbean temporality that conjugates the apocalyptic with the everyday, the present with the past and future. And what's more, it obliges us as spectators to share, albeit temporarily, this experience of time. In doing so, it conveys an experience of compromised agency that arises from contextual factors in the Caribbean, but might also be understood more broadly in reference to what Deborah Bird Rose has called the Anthropocene Noir, a looming darkness of shared complicity, guilt, and victimhood in which we're all, albeit differentially, situated. And I think that's really summed up, this conjugation of the apocalyptic and the everyday is summed up so nicely by this frame from the film. This kind of poster, or it's not graffiti, sign in the middle, La venida se acerca, can be translated into English roughly as the coming is at hand. Usually you would say La venida del Señor, or the Cristo se acerca, the coming of the Lord is at hand, but here the coming of what? We don't know, it's the coming is at hand. Candela opens with a prologue, a section that has an ambivalent relationship to the main narrative, sitting both inside and outside its flow of time. If the time of this scene is structurally ambivalent, then the performance of its central figure, who is both Candela and the Tisnao, but more on that later, also creates an ambivalent entanglement of past, present, and future. First of all, most obviously, we can highlight the Messianic Discourse of this figure, who offers a vision of the future after the destruction of the impending hurricane, which looms over the entire narrative of the film. This promised future depends first on the destruction of the status quo and an elimination of the past. However, the phrasing and imagery of the speech posit this end of the world as just another moment of destruction in the cycles of violence that have shaped the Caribbean. Thus, the anticipated future and the lived past contract and overlap. The details of the figure's messianic vision, moreover, lead us to a non-productive hedonism. The messianic promise, after all, consists of a carpe diem of cerveza y sol, of beer and sunshine. In this sense, the messianic vision implies not only the elimination of the past, but also the abolition of any future, and above all, the abolition of modernity's narrative of progress, which Deborah Bird Rose has very aptly described, I think, as a secularized version of messianic time. The Christian messianic promise, blessed be the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, is transfigured here through a Caribbean lens. Marginal and marginalized figures come to be the highest representatives of a temporal entanglement shaped by repeated natural, social, and historical disasters. This effect is amplified by the film's aesthetics, about which I'll say more in the final part of this talk. For now, though, we can note how this image seems to be situated outside time and admires us as viewers in a temporal entanglement, with its hypnotic effect modeled by the entranced audience on screen. The blinding shine of the figure's skin almost invites us to reach out and touch. Meanwhile, the mise-en-scène incites a contemplative mode, which arguably connects us with an aesthetics of queer cinema and slow cinema. Writing about the films of Antonioni, Roland Barthes noted that, and I quote, "To look longer than expected disturbs established orders of every kind, to the extent that normally the time of the look is controlled by society. Hence the scandalous nature of certain photographs in certain films, not the most indecent or the most combative, but just the most posed. By inciting contemplation of the posed composition of this frame, images like this one embed a critical or deconstructive power within the film, undermining the hegemony of the narrative drive. Thus, the tactile image that we contemplate while we listen to these messianic promises of the future, further undermines the notion of a clear separation and a linear progression between past, present, and future, and instead further mires us in temporal entanglement, making us feel, albeit in a limited and temporary way, a temporal paradox characteristic of the Caribbean. Scholarship on the Anthropocene has provided insights into changing understandings of scale, temporality, and agency associated with the idea that we have entered into a new geological age marked by the permanent systemic impact of human activity on the planet. As well as embodying a particular Caribbean temporality, I want to argue that the figure from the prologue, which is modeled on the Tisnao character traditional in Dominican Carnival, also condenses these Anthropocene entanglements. First, a brief explanation of this figure for those who might be unfamiliar with it. The name Tisnao is a contraction of Tisnalo, meaning sooty or blackened. This refers to the way in which the carnival costume was historically created using vegetable charcoal to blacken the face and torso. In more recent decades, these figures paint their bodies using a mixture, a base of burned blackened diesel oil, and then on top a kind of varnish to create shine. And this mixture never dries, so the sootiness can be transferred by touch. And this is important because in some regions' carnivals, the Tisnaos threaten to hug or touch people on the street unless they're given money. And in some processions, the Tisnaos serve to control and channel the crowds by threatening to touch and blacken participants or bystanders. In the Tisnao figure, we can see the colonial past of the Caribbean through the origins of carnival in Catholicism and its transformation through contact with Afro-descendant populations. We can also see colonialism's enduring legacy, informing the idea that Blackness, even in jest, can be experienced as something contagious and threatening. Finally, we can see condensed in the ambivalent tradition and centrality of the Tisnao to Dominican Carnival, the specific difficult relationship between the Dominican Republic and its neighboring Haiti, through annexations, wars, and massacres, to enduring anti-Haitian sentiment and legislation. Clearly, then, the Tisnao in Candela relates to physical, structural, and symbolic violence associated with the post-colonial Caribbean. But I want to suggest that it also invokes the entanglement of empire with environmental exploitation. David Bond's 2017 article on oil in the Caribbean sheds light on how, from the 1950s to the 1990s, the US, the World Bank, and other international organizations constructed and encouraged petroleum processing projects in the Caribbean, turning the region into a critical node in the networked empire of contemporary US power. But Bond goes further, arguing that from the 1970s, repeated spectacular oil spills, as well as more everyday environmental impacts, helped to create the conditions for what he calls an emerging knowledge of environmental precarity and vitality, and I would add relationality. In the article, he focuses on how mangroves became intelligible in terms of their economic worth and their ecological work. This view of hydrocarbon harm as productive of a new politics of environmental precarity and care complicates the predominant approach to fossil fuels in Anthropocene scholarship, where they are often understood primarily or most frequently in relation to a looming catastrophic future. Instead, it shows that, and I quote Bond, the disasters of oil are also a fractured history of the present and its possibility. In other words, the Tisnao's oiled torso also embodies the entangled temporalities of the Anthropocene. A violent past and an apocalyptic future interact in a present that contains the possibility of new terrains of knowledge, power, and resistance. In Candela, the Tisnao's messianic vision arguably speaks to a particular and especially entangled understanding of environmental apocalypse prevalent since the 1960s. In his book, From Apocalypse to Way of Life, Frederick Buell notes the shift away from the millennial fears of the period of nuclear accidents in the 1960s towards a banalization of environmental apocalypse, as ecological disaster became increasingly associated with contamination, environmental degradation, and the threat of systemic crisis, ushering in an accompanying crisis of human agency. Candela dramatizes this crisis of human agency through a noir-esque narrative that not only undermines the efforts of Detective Perez to solve the supposedly central crime, but also undermines the very centrality of that case itself through the displacement of the ominous atmosphere onto the impending hurricane around which the film is structured. In this way, the film gives the lie to the modernist separation of human from nature, a separation that's collapsing spectacularly in the Anthropocene, and according to writers such as Dipesh Chakrabarti, voiding all of our narratives of mastery and of the future, making it impossible to fully grasp the enormity of the coming apocalypse. However, in Candela, the focus is on really how this knowledge of coming apocalypse has been assimilated as something normal in our day-to-day existence, and the growing tension of the approaching hurricane transforms the tropes of the detective genre to show how our present era of banalized apocalypse is characterized by a compromised revelation that gives rise in turn to a compromised capacity to act, or at least to act meaningfully. In part 3, I'll say more about how the film's aesthetics make us experience this crisis of agency by admiring us in a temporality of the wait. But for now, I'll briefly consider the other points at which the Tisnao appears and how this relates to the investigation of the central crime and the possibility of action, justice, or redemption. So this screenshot is from the end of chapter 1. In chapter 1, the viewer is denied full knowledge of the crime, of the murder, as the camera backs gradually out of the room at the decisive moment in the struggle between Sera Peñablanca and Renato Castrate. The sequence ends with this image of the Tisnao with his back to the camera. If, as we've established in the prologue, the Tisnao is a kind of messianic figure, then this is an image of revelation denied. However, the fact that we eventually realize this is a flash forward, and we realize that this is a figure we have already seen, kind of evokes the messy temporality of the banalized apocalypse, a predicted future that is always already well assimilated into the present. In chapter 2, we see the Tisnao again when Detective Perez finds a toy cruise ship under his pillow, initiating a dreamlike sequence in which his apartment suddenly appears flooded with several inches of water, literally unmooring him and his belongings and bringing to mind the effects of a hurricane. Perez hears a sound and gets out his gun as he walks to the flooded corridor of his apartment building. Under the flickering, insalubrious light, we see over his shoulder the figure of the Tisnao, out of focus and with his back to us. As Perez reaches out to touch his shoulder, still pointing the gun, we hear the sounds of the hurricane. The movement triggers a kind of flashback that finally allows us to see the moment of the crime that we had been denied before. Just as quickly, we're back to the flickering yellow light of the corridor, and we see the Tisnao with his back still to us. The camera tracks backwards and the vision recedes. The sound of thunder and receding music accompanies Perez as he opens his eyes, but rather than awakening and action, the result is bathos. The seemingly ominous sounds are revealed to be nothing more than the electric fan and the traffic outside. It's an ordinary morning. So if the solution to the crime is a revelation, it's a banalized one that ultimately has no real consequences. In chapter 1, the film plays with and mocks the binary of anticipation and revelation by denying revelation to us only momentarily and immediately undermining any suspense created. But as we can see here in chapter 2, the film renders revelation literally inconsequential. In the investigations that Perez undertakes, visiting the morgue and the coroner, tracking down Sera in a sauna to interview her, it's not clear that the detective has assimilated into his conscious mind, at least, the message delivered in the dream. And even if he has, it's rendered irrelevant by the fact that he's eventually threatened and bought off by Sera's representative or bodyguard. The repeated reappearance of the Tisnao can be understood I think, as a reminder of how the entanglement of historic and contemporary environmental and social forms of violence have insinuated the apocalyptic into everyday life in the Caribbean, rendering it banal. But although Candela is far from a didactic tale about the need to regain a sense of moral urgency and agency in order to stave off environmental apocalypse, the Tisnao's final direct appearance at the end of chapter 2 does show, in a characteristically ambiguous way, the consequence of this entanglement and the subsequent crisis of human agency. It's significant that this final appearance relates a climactic confrontation and finality with a sort of practice of making do or making the best of things that's associated with the ongoing present in the wake of or the anticipation of catastrophe and calamity. Detective Perez has just accepted a bribe to stay off the Serra Peña Blanca case, and he decides to spend the money on a night out with his lover, the prostitute, at this cabaret. I won't comment here about the name of the cabaret, but maybe if we have time in the questions, we could come back to this. I think it's quite interesting. Anyway, it's in this space of indefinite delay of putting off his duties as a detective during a cigarette break, in fact, outside the cabaret, that the Tisnao finds Detective Perez. As Perez turns, he sees the Tisnao standing in the street facing away from him. This is the same shot we've seen at the end of chapter 1. We hear the wind and wind chimes of the hurricane, suggesting we're drawing closer to the eye of the storm. Perez pulls out his gun, aims it, and walks towards Tisnao, who now appears to be facing towards him. The viewer, however, still can't see the Tisnao's face as the camera remains behind him. When we come back to face the Tisnao from Perez's perspective, the Tisnao is facing the other way again. In other words, the continuities in space and time seem to be broken. The wind picks up and the Tisnao slowly turns around. As Perez shoots, we see him in a close-up that leaves the gun out of the frame. So when we hear the sound of the gunshot, which turns into thunder, we can't be sure where the gunshot has come from. A long shot then shows Perez collapsed to the ground, looking down as if confused about how he could have possibly shot himself. The wind continues to howl, and there's an abrupt cut to black. No further avoidance or escape is possible for Perez. Whether or not he actually dies here, the viewer never sees him again. He's effectively been wiped out in the very midst of his escapism, an avoidance that exists in symbiotic relationship with and perpetuates the structural violence of which the crime is just one manifestation. The third chapter of the film is divided into these kind of 3 chapters, and the third one is entitled Tisnao, but it's the only chapter in which the Tisnao figure doesn't appear as such. Instead, the focus is on Lubrini, who is also played by Cesar Dominguez. The same actor plays the Tisnao, Candela, and Lubrini. And so this variation with difference, this kind of repetition with variation, indicates that the perpetual horizon of apocalypse remains. In a sonic figuring of the banalized apocalypse, by the end of chapter 3, the Tisnao dissolves not into nothing, but into everything, as the sounds of the hurricane take over during the film's credits. In this final section of the talk, I just want to address how the film not only represents, but also makes us inhabit this kind of entanglement, suggesting that cinema might, in fact, be a privileged medium for exploring and evoking this state. First of all, to develop on from the previous reading of the failures of Detective Perez, I want to refer to a 2012 article by Theodore Martin called The Long Wait. Martin analyzes 2 21st century texts, Sacred Games by Vikram Chandra and The Yiddish Policeman's Union by Michael Chabon, in order to argue that contemporary noir fiction moves away from a model of readership that mimics the detective in search for answers, in order to insist instead that we become aware of and inhabit a long wait. In Chandra and Chabon's respective novels, the detectives manage to prevent a crime, but its solution postpones rather than preventing apocalyptic disaster. And so this threat of apocalypse continues to hang over the present as a possibility. Anticipation and threat are extended indefinitely. Similarly, in Candela, the non-solution of the crime resolves nothing, as the overarching sense of anticipation and threat continues to build with the approaching hurricane. For Martin, the importance of the wait in contemporary detective fiction doesn't lie in the anticipated end to which the wait leads, but rather in the way in which the wait transforms our experience of the present. Indeed, in Candela, the answers, such as they are present almost from the very beginning of the film. Not only is the solution clear at the start of chapter 2, but we could even argue that the lead up to the struggle makes it clear who done it. So instead of watching for the solution, we watch for the experience of the present as it's conveyed by the film, as well as our own real-time experience of the film. Whereas traditional understandings of detective fiction define it in relation to, and I quote Martin, a constant looking forward to a well-nigh utopian moment of absolute knowledge, Theodore Martin's reading of recent noir fiction offers a redemptive revalorization of the wait because of how it can alter time, slowing it down, stretching it out, and forcing us to take our time. By contrast, in the context of Candela, this temporality of the wait can be understood as an expression of entanglement, disempowerment, and complicity in the face of a context shaped by cyclical forms of violence and a banalized global apocalypse, as we've seen. Through careful pacing, repeated or very similar sequences, and an evocation of haptic visuality, the film forces us to inhabit more fully the weird temporality that results from what I've called Caribbean and Anthropocene entanglements. After visiting the morgue and talking to the coroner, Pérez finds out that Renato's death was caused not by his fall, but by a stab wound. He then tracks down Sera in a subterranean sauna, where the dense, damp air seems to mire both characters in a claustrophobic atmosphere of guilt and complicity. And I think we can see this as a visual figuring of the shared complicity that characterizes what Deborah Bird-Rose calls the Anthropocene Noir. Immediately afterwards, we encounter an ambiguous sequence that might be dream or reality. The image of the cruise ship on the horizon connects this sequence to the dream sequence that led to the revelation of the crime. From facing the cruise ship, we're suddenly in the water as the camera bobs around with the waves. Pérez swims out of focus somewhere in the middle ground. Finally, an overhead shot shows him floating, arms and legs akimbo, drifting. As if now totally out of his depth following the partial immersion of the sauna, Detective Pérez is shown fully immersed in an immense black sea, in over his head in something much bigger than he could ever broach on his own. Shots like these, I think, offer us images of immersion and submersion, literal and metaphorical. The metaphors of steam and water and the use of out-of-focus shots and close-ups recall Laura Marks' notion of haptic visuality, a kind of aesthetic that, and I quote Marks, brings vision close to the body and into contact with other sense perceptions, making vision multisensory. Both the sauna and sea sequences not only evoke this kind of haptic visuality, but they also diffuse and fragment bodies and blur the boundaries between figures and their surroundings. I think this conveys an entanglement, an experience of entanglement that resembles being submerged, immired, or floating. And these states all emphasize a sense of compromised mobility and agency within an interminable present, always overshadowed by something ominous on the horizon or just outside the frame. In this frame here on the left, this haptic quality is related more explicitly still to the experience of waiting and a compromised sense of agency. Leaving the police station where he's just been forced to accept that the official verdict on Renato's death is that it's a suicide, Lubrini boards a crowded bus in the heat. I think in this shot, we can feel his discomfort as he sweats. And here I want to return briefly to Theodore Martin's analysis of Vikram Chandra's Sacred Games, particularly his analysis of the moment when the detective becomes trapped in a traffic jam. Having prevented, at least temporarily, nuclear annihilation, the detective in Sacred Games finds himself stuck in a traffic jam which Martin describes as, and I quote, perhaps our most iconic symbol of wasted time, time in which there's nothing to do but watch time pass. However, this acquires a positive valence for Martin because the detective is no longer waiting for something. And I quote again, the relentless forward thrust of the detective narrative has finally collapsed into its obverse, a constant open-ended sense of anticipation, a state of readiness that has no specific object. By contrast, the static framing of Detective Pérez throughout Candela reinforces the sense of anything but a relentless forward thrust in the supposedly central narrative. Meanwhile, the impending threat of the hurricane throughout ensures that there's always a sense of anticipation. But as we've seen, this doesn't result in a readiness for action, but rather in a kind of deferral and a perpetuation of the status quo that has contributed to impending disaster. So film, I suggest, is a privileged medium for conveying the complexity of entanglement because of how it can create a multi-layered, multi-sensory experience that makes us temporarily inhabit or inhabit more intensely specific situated experiences, particularly a specific experience of time. But we can also approach this from another angle, and this is where I wanted to bring in this idea of storiation. In their recent book, Anthropocene Islands, David Chandler and Jonathan Pugh define storiation as a core analytic that has emerged from increasing analytical engagement with islands to move beyond the constraints of conventional ontologies and epistemologies. Storiation, in their words, seeks to materially reveal and register forms of relation and interconnection which modernist framings are necessarily blind to. So I want to propose that Candela's adaptation of the detective genre, where the conventional revelation is rendered irrelevant, and it's submerged within this larger sense of entanglement and threat, can also be understood in terms of this rejection of modernist demands that all should be revealed, ordered, and instrumentalized, which is characteristic of the analytic of storiation. In contrast to correlation, an analytic according to which islands are read as a sign of a wider reality, storiation offers a different way of knowing the Anthropocene by registering legacies of entanglement in embodied ways. Storiation is not about something, but rather is or does that something. Although I've been discussing Candela in relation to different kinds of entanglement, I've tried to emphasize that above all, it is and does this entanglement rather than representing or being about it in some correlative way. Examples of texts that storiate from a grounding in islands register, according to Chandler and Pugh, a thickness of the now with all of its ecological and temporal entanglements. And I think we can understand this sequence as paradigmatic of the film's ability to evoke the thickness of the now. And this is the sequence where Renato recites his poem whilst being held at gunpoint by Sera, and we watch this tracking shot of the streets and inhabitants of Santo Domingo. If storiation is about, and I quote, revealing another world in the world or producing alterity as such, the film more generally is a privileged medium of storiation, and Candela, for all of its meditations on compromised agency and entanglement, retains this possibility of kind of opening up or revealing another world within the world and opening up speculative possibilities. And I think that's really encapsulated in the last line of this poem, El mar de todos los adjetivos, the sea of all adjectives.
I was going to start talking, but I was silent. Thank you so much, Dunja. And I just wanted to tell the people in the audience, I see that some people are raising hands. If you could just pop your questions right below, if you move to the right, there's a Q&A box, and I'll be taking those questions that way. We have 20 minutes for questions, so it's a lot of time, but not that much time, because I know that we always get a kind of burst of questions at the last 5 minutes. So please type them in, and I will be taking your questions for Dunja. That was wonderful. Thank you so much, and gave us all so much to think about. And while I wait for people, I'm going to have this kind of chair's privilege, and I'm going to ask. I think I agree with everything you're saying about this kind of distended temporality that we're just plunged into, and you feel it, especially the waiting for a hurricane, which is probably, you know, the most banal waiting in the Caribbean, because it happens pretty much every year. And the way that you feel it is absolutely in a haptic kind of sonorous way. You see the people sweating a little bit more profusely, and you think it's coming. But I was wondering if you could say a bit more, because you were talking about El Tiznao and how they disappear into this kind of soundscape of storminess, especially at the end. That's how we finish. That we finish with sound. And I was wondering if you could say a bit about silences in the film, because it's, you know, it's a film that has, you know, nature sounds. It's got performative sounds, because we have the beautiful sounds of boleros being sung in the nightclub. But then there's also what I found, you know, just like that kind of the thing that never comes is, for example, the voice of Sera Peñablanca, the white upper class murderess, let's call her, and I was wondering what we make about these absences in dialogue, and how they kind of figure into this narrative of entanglement and temporality. Because, you know, obviously, if we're thinking of storiation, we also think that narrative is propelled in a film, hopefully in a traditional way, through dialogue. But there's an absence of dialogue that is being supplanted with other kinds of kind of progression or non-progression. So if you could, I wondered if you could speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I hadn't thought about silences as such, but I think that it's part of the way in which the film sort of undermines its own narrative drive in a way. We don't have any kind of traditional, I suppose, exposition via dialogue that would be helpful and would kind of create that sense of linear progression. So I think that's one thing. I think this silences as well, they sort of emphasize that experience of waiting. As we're watching the film, we're waiting for them to say something, we're waiting for some kind of clarification that very often doesn't come. And I think that admires us further in this kind of experience of watching the film. But I think in relation to Sera Peñablanca, that's a really interesting point. I think maybe the absence of dialogue retains a certain complexity or a certain kind of lack of clarity or opacity maybe around certain figures. Sera Peñablanca is a really interesting one as well, because I think I couldn't sort of fit it into this presentation, but the way that she's represented with her head cut off in so many frames, if you go back and you notice how she's represented, very often her head is either partially or completely sort of severed by the frame. And I think her lack of voice is related to that sense in which she is the criminal, she is the perpetrator of violence, but she herself is also a victim of a kind of violence, gendered violence, for example. There's a brilliant line that I also didn't manage to fit into the presentation, but during the kind of, it looks like a business lunch, but it's a sort of celebration of her coming wedding with this important figure. Somebody proposes a toast to the union of tradition, the future and tradition, right? Which is a perfect image for this idea of repeating kind of cycles of violence. And we can see that Sera, despite her privileged position, I mean, her surname is Peñablanca, so she is, on a white mountain in an ivory tower overlooking the sea in her apartment. She is also a kind of victim, and I think that messiness maybe is preserved quite well also by the silences in the film. That sort of that sense of being both a victim and a criminal.
Yeah, no, and of course you end up feeling sorry for her at the end. Again, the line that she does say is "El mar de todos los adjetivos," and then she plunges herself from the balcony. So again, when we do hear from her, we hear repetition. We hear a line that we've already heard.
Yes.
So no, I found that fascinating, and I think another kind of, this is a film that kind of yielded a lot of black holes, just things getting sucked into areas where there's no possible signification, And for me, the other one is that I forget her name, but the figure of the elderly woman who's got who has dementia, and so there's also this kind of this other pool of that is dragging memory, that is dragging kind of communication away from the narrative within this character, and it was very. It was very poignant, because then she's also she undoes whatever futurity there was for our protagonist, because she basically has washed away the cocaine that he had to go deliver, right? No, so I don't have any questions yet, but I know that they're going to come in when we least expect them. Another thing that I wanted to ask you was about, well, this vision of the Caribbean is always apocalyptic. And you mentioned Antonio Benítez Rojo as a kind of anti-apocalyptic thinker. And to think of those figures just walking down the street on the eve of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I'm wondering, with regard to this, I mean, there's a kind of repeated kind of theorization of the Caribbean as that place where the place that is preparing us for the apocalypse, the place that is already seeing an apocalypse, the place that saw an apocalypse almost in 1492. Do you think that the film also envisions ways out of that thinking?
Yeah, that's such a good question, because I really struggled with that. I don't know whether anybody else experiences this, but when you're presenting about something, you almost feel like you have to tie it in a neat bow at the end and say that there is a way out. And I think that's what I try to do in a very, very minimal way with reference to storiation, because Chandler and Pugh talk about how storiation, in registering these kind of embodied legacies, and in doing and being those things, it produces alterity, and in doing so, there's an opening for something different to emerge. And I think that's as far as we could go with this film. I think, I was reading, this turn in scholarship away from the apocalyptic because of the need to problematize narratives where Caribbean people are basically divested of any agency. But we can't deny that when we're watching this film, it really does problematize the sense of agency. And so that's where I think it's really just about conveying that lived experience of feeling kind of entangled and admired. And of course, the film opens with a quotation from Virgilio Piñera's famous poem La Isla en Peso, which I think is translated as the whole island, which refers to that island condition as, like a cancer being surrounded by water on all sides, which again is to do with that sense of compromised mobility and agency, I think. So I think in a way, the film is quite a salutary resistance against the demand that sometimes is placed on the Caribbean to produce narratives of resilience and kind of solutions, if you like, for this banalized apocalypse that we're all facing, and some are facing more acutely than others. But I am interested in continuing to think about what that production of alterity and what that, I suppose, the position that it puts us in as viewers and the experience that it makes us have, whether that could be understood perhaps through the lens of ethics, for example, as producing some kind of new knowledge or new disposition to the situation.
And also in the alteration of the temporal, the normative temporality. What we thought was going to die doesn't die. Obviously, we know that nothing's going to, but even in jigging the order around, there's a kind of, we at least breathe for another second for that character. We feel there's a tiny glimmer of hope, even though it's undisclosed. But yeah, I think there are avenues through that to continue exploring that. I have a question from Sasha, and let me see. She said, excellent talk. I was wondering if you could speak more to this idea of agency. The moments of agency that characters do take seem tended to be violent, incite awful outcomes, or hurt people around them, as though the only way to be a meaningful individual is by being violent. So I was wondering also what you think the film is asking of the audience. So 2 questions: moments of agency and violence, and what the audience is asked to do.
Yeah. I'm not sure whether really the film actually allows us to see any of the actions as expressions of agency, in the fullest sense of the word, because I think that the film really shows us how people's actions are in fact reactions or overdetermined by the context in which they are. So in the sense that, a lot of these actions are kind of violent and negative, I think the film, well, for me anyway, from my reading, was inviting us more to see that as a reflection of the web in which people are entangled, rather than as some kind of expression of agency. But I think an interesting maybe counterpoint or counterexample is maybe to be found in the relationship of Lubrini with his, I'm not sure whether it's his mother or grandmother, or whether it's the grandmother of Renato. I think it might be the grandmother of Renato. That relationship of kind of care and the way that they sort of, despite the inability to communicate in a conventional way, the way that they sort of communicate and understand each other, particularly in that kind of second scene where they seem to commiserate over the grief of losing Renato. And also maybe in the relationship of Lubrini with Perez's, not Perez's daughter, but when he goes to give that dance lesson, right? There's this kind of idea of the show must go on, and that friendship. There's these sort of hints of, maybe it's not agency, but there's this hint of kind of human feeling, empathy and sympathy, and maybe a sort of solidarity in that kind of shared suffering, perhaps. In terms of the second question, I'm wondering what you think the film is asking of its audience. I think that the film is, what I've tried to suggest in the reading that I've offered today is more that the film is asking us to kind of immerse ourselves in this experience, to understand, not in an intellectual way, but in a sort of lived way, what this experience might be like for an hour and a half, the duration of the film. And I think that reflects really the Caribe Pop Manifesto, which really tries to convey that experience of, what is it to ser y estar, to be in the Caribbean? What does that mean? And actually the manifesto itself is, the darkness of the film doesn't come out of nowhere, in the sense that the manifesto itself is also quite dark and quite critical. So I think the film is asking us to immerse ourselves in that. I'm not sure that it's asking us necessarily to make moral judgments, as in a conventional sense. Yeah. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
And of course, I mean, I wanted to go back to the scene of the cabaret, because you said that we could go back to this idea, because the cabaret is also another kind of immersive space within the the larger space of the film, and with cabaret scenes, we're always immersed in a kind of secondary performance. And there's these really wonderful scenes of performance and spectatorship. And I found that the spectatorship in the film was very open, because this is a film about queerness, and we have these kind of incredibly hybrid spaces of hybrid sexuality, the cabaret. And I wondered if you could speak about that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that we can understand the cabaret in relation to the idea of carnival. There's a sense of a kind of carnival as being a space in which hierarchies are kind of inverted, and it's a temporary space or moment, if you like, of disruption. I think the cabaret has a similar kind of liminality to it in terms of this being a space where interactions and expressions can happen that don't find a place in kind of mainstream society, right? That's why Sera Peñablanca goes to the cabaret, to have sex with lower class strangers, and Candela can express, this, I suppose it's a drag performance, isn't it? That we see Candela perform. But I think that just as well as being this space of kind of temporary relief inversion, actually the cabaret is a space that sheds light on the mainstream society. It's a place outside the usual time and space of the narrative and the society, but also gives us privileged insight into it. And I think then it's significant to notice that the cabaret is called La Remora. And then this name, La Remora, it's a kind of fish that's native to tropical waters that survives by attaching itself to a host animal, like a shark. And in ancient times, apparently, these fish were believed to hold back ships, and hence the Latin name means delay. And of course, in Spanish, remora also means obstacle or hindrance. So it kind of suggests this idea of biological symbiosis that I think goes back to what I've been trying to call entanglement, this entangled, or I suppose, ecological picture offered by the film. But it also provides a sort of ironic commentary, I think, on the symbiotic relationship between corruption and violence. And this kind of gives a lie again to that supposed separation between the human and the natural realms, between social violence and environmental disaster. Because Perez goes there when he decides to accept the bribe, and we can see how corruption continues to sort of uphold the status quo in Dominican society.
I was also thinking about how the film and what we're being shown in such a beautiful and striking way connects back to like wider Dominican history, wider Dominican police history as well, and I kept asking myself, does this film feel kind of Caribbean, pan-Caribbean? Does this film feel really Dominican? And it's I think that it could have been set anywhere in the Caribbean, really, with, as we were discussing before the talk, with the attendant incredible memory that this is Dominican Spanish that is being spoken, obviously. But no, and I in the last 2 minutes I wanted to ask, because I don't if there's any burning questions, you have 1 minute, but I wanted to ask about Caribe Pop and what next, because again, I would like to thank the production team for letting us watch this film, and I think it needs to tour everywhere in Europe and in the UK. They have this manifesto. This film is is certified as it completely complies with the manifesto. This is what we read at the beginning. So what's next for them? Do you know?
I think it's a manifesto that sort of emerged at a particular moment in time, and has produced like lots of interesting kind of spin-offs in terms of particularly Rey Andújar's work. So Rey is an author, but he's also a performer. He's an amazing performer of poetry, and he does plays, and he's also published books. I think it's a book of poetry as Lubrini. So Lubrini becomes a kind of alter ego that then, so it's a meta universe, I think. But from what I've recently spoken with Andres, the director, I think he's kind of moving in a different direction right now. He sees the Caribe Pop as really like defining kind of moment where they sort of found each other, and there was this discovery that they were thinking and experiencing things along the same lines. But I think he's turning to other areas in his next work. But one thing I thought was interesting maybe to point out was that Andres, he studied at the International Film School in Cuba, in San Antonio de los Baños, and he was telling me how it was that experience of being elsewhere in the Caribbean that really opened his eyes to kind of the Caribbean, as it were, like this experience, the idea of a shared experience. I think that's very much a commonplace, isn't it? This idea that you discover Caribbeanness often from a distance, from the diaspora, or through these spaces that allow the interaction of different experiences from within the region. And I think the International Film School in Cuba has been really important for that. It's actually been a really important space for the emergence of Dominican cinema, particularly since the passing of the new film law in 2011. If we look at some of the most prominent filmmakers in this, if you like, new wave of Dominican cinema, many of them were trained in the film school in Cuba. So yes, I think that's an interesting.
No, it's great to see just how, you know, that film is getting funded. I mean, there's a kind of huge kind of like, there's 20 companies, you know, funding Candela, but the result is absolutely marvelous, and I can't wait to see. Well, Farías Cintrón has a wonderful vision, so, but yes. I think it was great. Well, we must end here. Thank you. I would like to thank Dunja for giving us this wonderful, wonderful talk. And I really hope that those of you who are in the audience and those of you who are going to see us in the webinar on our Torch YouTube channel, you will have a chance to watch Candela soon or in the near future. And what remains for me is to thank you all, the audience, again, for being here. We will be in touch, and you will find out more through the Torch website about oncoming their new Hillary term activities and webinars. So please stay tuned and look us up on torch.ox.ac.uk. So thank you very much all for coming.
Thank you.